Okay. Hello and welcome to my website. I'm gonna go over the revisions that I made for projects 1, 2, and 3 here. For project 1, the main feedback was that I got was that I didn't explain how each source that I was using in my annotated bibliography was relevant to the argument I would end up making in project 3. So as you can see, the bolded part is what I've added. I haven't added a lot of material, but I'm basically explaining in this short sentence how this source is relevant. I'll just read it out. The source is significant evidence that large pharmaceutical companies, particularly Purdue Pharma Inc., are guilty of bribing physicians into prescribing more opioids to make a larger profit from them. This serves as a pillar to my argument that Purdue are responsible for kickstarting the opioid crisis. Even though this source is blaming physicians for accepting bribes, the companies are at fault for offering these incentives in the first place. So this is basically like a bit of a logical leap that I'm making here. That's how I kind of expand on that on my first source. The second source, the John Oliver video, Last Week Tonight episode. So it's not a scholarly source, but it does have fact-checked, documented evidence of Purdue's wrongdoing. So I'll just read this part out too. The second part of the episode is the illustration of my main argument that Purdue and the Sackler family are guilty of unethical business practices, such as lying, concealing the true nature of their product. Even though it is a comedy show and not a scholarly source, it is fact-checked and does point out some important facts about my argument. As I mentioned, it is only the second part of the episode that is relevant to the argument. The first part talks about drug distributors and their role in the crisis, so I actually don't mention them at all in my argument, and I'm only really using the second part, especially the end where he uses actors and comedians to imitate Richard Sackler, because at the time there was no footage of his deposition. So this is actually this is a key pillar of my argument as well, and I think that adding this little bit of clarification was an important part of my revision in when I'm talking about this source. For the third article, so this is a scholarly article, so I did think I did a good job of summarizing it, but here I added this short sentence. This scholarly article serves as a nuanced view that gives a solid counter-argument against Purdue being solely responsible for the crisis. It shows that there are other factors at play, such as a weak regulatory framework, even though I may not use it as a source for my argument because it is very dense and I don't want to take it out of context. So, yes, actually I did not end up using this source in my argument. I ended up using a primary research article from the Western Journal of Emergency Medicine instead, because this is very it's very dense. It has a lot of information and it's very nuanced, and it's hard to actually pick out. It's not taking sides in any argument, and it's not really I don't want to take it out of context, so it was safer for me to actually not use it in my argument, even though I do explain it, and I do think it is important because it gave me some good information on the opioid crisis for me to then work off of. So that is for the Salvatore et al. Article. And then this last source, unknown author, so just because of that, I had to discard it because it lacks credibility because it has an unknown author. And I'll just read the sentence I added for this. So this document will serve as the bulk of the empirical and documented evidence for Purdue's unethical behavior with OxyContin. Even though the article is very careful when blaming the company, some explicit content is referenced regarding the recent litigation involving Purdue. I may not use this article for the defense of my argument because there is no author listed. Therefore, its credibility is somewhat limited in the context of my argument. So as I was saying, it has limited credibility, but then again, it gives insight for me. It gives me a lot of good information, and even though I say I may not reference it, I may actually go back and use it. So for project 3, and it depends on what purpose for what purpose I would actually end up using it, and there would be if I can find other empirical evidence that is more credible, I would end up using another source than this one. So that's it for my revision of Project 1. So I think it's fairly comprehensive. I hope I clarified anything that was confusing. Um, and let's move on to Project 2 now. So the explainer. So again, I clarified a few things in the introduction. Therefore, ever since opioids were first introduced over 100 years ago, physicians were always wary of ordering and prescribing them. They are typically given only for severe and acute pain like broken bones. So there was a bit of confusion over the timeline in my introduction for Project 2, so I wanted to clarify that OxyContin was released in 1996, and the opioid crisis started pretty much right around that time. 1996 to 2000 is about the timeline of when the opioid crisis started. Opioids themselves were first ever introduced in the early 1900s, late 1800s. And ever since then, as I said, physicians were always wary of prescribing. So morphine has been around forever. Heroin has been around forever. But OxyContin, this FDA-approved pain medication, was released in 1996. And the reason it kickstarted the opioid crisis, in my view, is because it was marketed as a non-addictive opioid. So just wanted to clarify the timeline there in the introduction. And then when I put these side-by-side views, so you don't have to be a chemist to realize that these are very similar structures. They're obviously not exactly the same if you look where they are, and that's OxyContin and heroin. So here I just added a sentence clarifying and explaining that it's not just their bond line structure that's similar, it's actually their mechanism of action. So all opioids act in the same way. They all block the opioid receptors in our brain, which are our brain's way of signaling to us that we're feeling pain. So in that sense, they're completely psychoactive. And that is true of OxyContin, of heroin, of morphine, of Percocet, of fentanyl, of a lot of other drugs that I've mentioned in my previous project. So I'll just read off the sentence I added. In the image above, we can see the obvious visual similarity between the two chemical compounds, even with no knowledge of chemistry. Chemically, they work the same. They block the opioid receptors in the brain, thus blocking the signal of pain, which has a byproduct of creating a high that can lead to addiction. So yeah, that's what makes them psychoactive, is they block pain receptors. Opioid receptors are called. That's why they're called opioid medications in our brain, which is our interpretation of pain. And yeah, that's what makes them addictive, and that's what makes them dangerous. But they're very effective at blocking pain, which is why they're widely used for severe acute pain. And I also added this video about Russell Portnoy. So he was a respected pain management specialist. I go over this in the work. I didn't think I needed to clarify anything else other than adding a video of him, because that was also one of the recommendations. So I did do that, and in this video, if you watch it, he defends himself actually fairly well about, like, if we knew then what we know now, we would be in better shape. And obviously it's hindsight is 2020 is essentially the summary of this video, but I encourage you to watch it if it gives some additional information. And then finally I clarify the conclusion a little bit. So I just add to my conclusion that was probably not comprehensive enough. So opioids are necessary for certain patients, and drugs like OxyContin should continue to exist for this reason, but physicians should only prescribe opioid medications like OxyContin, morphine, Percocet, and numerous others in the cases of severe pain like cancer, surgery, severe injuries, and no longer for what I call mundane pain, which is like backaches, toothaches. And I don't even think it should be prescribed for chronic pain, because that's chronic pain that lasts a long time. I don't think opioids are a solution, because, as we said, they're addictive, and over time they can cause addiction. So it's not a matter of taking morphine versus OxyContin. They both basically do the same thing. I think that those other types of pain that I'm discussing, backaches, toothaches, should be treated with non-opioid pain medications like Tylenol and ibuprofen that can just be obtained over the counter and don't need to be prescribed. So that's pretty much it for Project 2. So now I'm going to go over my quick revision of Project 3, which I personally evaluated as probably my best project of the 3. I definitely put in the most effort, and it was definitely the most challenging for me to to work on. So here again, what is in bold is what I've added or changed. So the graph here, I'm just commenting on this graph because that was something I felt needed clarification. And it's kind of small too. So these are a list of different opioid medications here. This graph shows a sharp increase in overdose deaths from various types of drugs, including opioids, since the late 1990s. So this is basically the onset of the opioid crisis to basically today. So it shows a surge around 2012 that demonstrates that the crisis is very much still ongoing and is nowhere near solved. If anything, it is getting worse. So yeah, this is basically kind of a visual illustration of the opioid crisis. I'm not trying to infer anything beyond that other than just give a visual timeline illustration of basically this gradual increase and then this sharp increase later in the 2000s that actually I don't explain. I don't actually have an explanation for that. Mainly because my argument was that OxyContin was released in 1996, which is before the start of this timeline. But yeah, so I added a little bit of a comment there. I also commented on Sackler's deposition, so this is like about a 4-minute video where he basically admits that OxyContin is twice as potent as morphine. So Sackler's deposition is very revealing, that it tells us that the company executives were aware at the time that OxyContin was launched, namely that it is twice as potent as morphine, which was concealed from physicians for a long time. So yeah, this is basically admitting that it's twice as powerful as morphine is basically saying that it is, if anything, it's just as addictive as morphine, and it should be used with the same caution that morphine is used with. Like, you very rarely see people get morphine prescribed. It's actually seen as unethical to write morphine for people that don't have cancer. And I think OxyContin should be treated the same way. It should be used in the same way that morphine is used. And so I just commented on my own video that I posted on YouTube. So in this video, I expand on my written work in an attempt to offer some context and nuance to my argument, while still standing by my position and offering the same documented empirical evidence as in the paper without hopefully any inconsistencies. So yeah, so here I'm just basically just adding a little caption to my video, just give it a little context. And obviously I put it at the end of the paper because I want people to read the paper before watching the video, because the video is really supposed to be a supplement to the paper and not a summary. So therefore they're part of the same continuum is the way I would describe it. And then I added a little bit to my reflection. So one of the questions in the reflection was, is there anything else that you would like your professor to know about the work on this project? And I actually did not mention that because I didn't have anything to comment on at the time. But now, reflecting back, I'd like my professor to know that working on this project was both challenging and rewarding because it offered me the opportunity to expand my scope of thinking and writing, as well as help me become a more creative and well-rounded college student. So yeah, Project 3 really, I think, brought out the best of my work, if I'm like honest in assessing how I've done throughout this semester. I think that I've done like appropriate revisions, in my view, of each project, but I think Project 3 was the one I did best on. I think arguing is something I enjoy doing overall, and when I have a strong opinion about something, I usually stand by it, even though I am really always open to other views, to new information that comes out, because new information always comes out about the opioid crisis, especially now. So yeah, I'm really glad that I did this. It was hard work. It was definitely not easy, especially filming myself and being comfortable in front of a camera. All of those parts were really challenging, but as I said, yeah, it's ultimately very rewarding, and I think I came out of this a much better student. And as I've explained in my reflections on all the outcomes for each project, what I've learned, how I've improved, how I've achieved each SLO, and how I've hopefully grown as a student throughout this semester. So thank you for listening. This is basically my reflection on the revisions I've made for each project. They're not that detailed, but I think they're appropriate, and thank you for listening.